where do we root the practice of expository preaching in Scripture? Now, you mentioned preach the word. That's logos. It's not graphe. And I believe earlier he says all Scripture, graphe, is inspired by God, speaking of the Old Testament when Paul wrote that. Is logos in that use preach the word? Is it a technical reference to an idea, i.e. the gospel, or is it a reference to the graphe, the Scriptures?
Yeah, I'll start on this. I mean, I have some opinions. I think contextually, immediate context, preach the word logos almost always that I can think of in Pauline epistles and Acts is specifically referring to the message of salvation through Christ. So it's in a sense like preach the gospel, we would say. But that gospel message we know is in the Scriptures. That's special revelation. So I think it can be expanded to mean the Scriptures, although graphe is not used there, as you brought up. Oftentimes we use the word and just kind of make it interchangeable with the Bible. But the biblical writers themselves often don't do that. They're going to say writings, right, to when they're referring to Scripture. So preach the word, I think immediately, and Ryan might have Dr. Rippee might have a different opinion here, but I think it's specifically the message of salvation. It is the gospel that can be expanded out at that point, secondarily to bring.
So
to
you would say it'd
Scripture.
be too narrow to just say that means the message of salvation.
I don't know if it's too narrow because, well, maybe, but I mean it is contextually it's the message of the gospel. But by expansion, that message of the gospel, we know it through the written revelation of in the Scriptures.
So, Dr. Rippee, we'll pass that to you. But the second question is, where would we root the practice of expository preaching in Scripture if it's not in that passage? Are there other passages that we could go to, or other implications that we could say? Here would be a great implication to say this is why that should be the pastor's regular practice.
That's a great question. I mean, I think to the first question about the word, you have in chapter 3, before he gets to chapter 4, verse 2, he's saying all Scripture is inspired by God.
Yeah.
And he has in mind the Old Testament as he's telling Timothy, and it's that same Scripture he's saying preach the word. And I think the connection is if we were to take the teaching of Jesus about Luke 24, beginning with Moses, all these Scriptures point to me. Paul's understanding, Timothy, you are preaching the gospel. This gospel was preached beforehand in the Old Testament. All of the Scriptures are pointing to Jesus. It's why we're Christ-centered in our preaching. The Trinitarian, God the Father and God the Spirit are the most Christ-centered persons in the universe. The Father says, "This is my Son, listen to him." And the Spirit's whole ministry in this new covenant age is to shine a floodlight on Jesus as the Paraclete. And so Jesus rebuked the Pharisees. You search the Scriptures, you think in them you have life, but it's these that testify of me. So I'm giving you a little more of my Christ-centeredness understanding here, but you have even Ezra, when they rebuilt the tabernacle, he's explaining the meaning of the Scriptures to the people.
Chapter 8.
Yeah.
8, verse 8, that's what I was thinking.
And then you have the book of Hebrews is our first sermon, and it's a book of the Bible. I read a fascinating academic work that argued that the book of Hebrews is an exposition of Psalm 110. And I'm going to be doing some further writing this summer on it and hopefully publishing it later in August. But it's fascinating to take the book of Hebrews as an example of expository preaching. And what you see there is you don't see a micro-exegesis. You see an exegesis of Psalm 110. You see going to other passages, forming expositional theology from other parts of the Psalms, but this main emphasis of Jesus is better is coming from Psalm 110. He's the one seated at the right hand of the Father.
Wow.